So, welcome to Smart Talk, where we speak with leading academics and other thoughtful persons on the important challenges facing the world today. My name is Edward Dodson. I am a longtime member of the faculty of the Henry George School of Social Science. In this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Jason M. Barr, professor of economics at the Newark, New Jersey campus of Rutgers University. A prime interest of his is the combination of natural, social, political, and entrepreneurial factors that keep producing higher and higher buildings in the world's cities. His first book on the subject, Building the Skyline, The Birth and Growth of Manhattan Skyscrapers, was published in 2016. In his new book, just published this year, Cities in the Sky, The Quest to Build the World's Tallest Skyscrapers, Professor Barr takes readers on a world tour of the places where skyscrapers are reaching ever higher. He provides a significant insight into the reasons why such tall buildings are the appropriate market response to demand in some locations and not in others, at least until the time and circumstances are right. You can learn more about Professor Barr's research and activities at his website, www.jasonmbarr.com. Professor Barr, welcome to Smart Talk.
Well, thank you for having me. This is great. Thank you.
Well, the first question that I have for you is really, as an economist, how did you get so interested in the construction process and the development process that has resulted in the turnover in many cities of the old much lower level buildings into these skyscrapers, before we get into some of the economics? But how did you get interested in the subject?
Sure. Well, actually, my interest really starts with New York City history. I grew up on Long Island, and actually, I was born in 1970, and so the 70s and early 80s was a very weird, hard time for New York, um, and so I lived in the suburbs. So my perception of New York was just sort of on the outside looking in. But as I was in my 20s, I went to graduate school at Columbia in New York. So as I got to New York, I really developed a fascination with it. When I was in the economics department for graduate school, my wife would joke with me because she'd always see me reading like a New York City history book. She says, "You're in the wrong department. You should be in the history department." So it was really out of my interest in New York City history and learning more about New York's tall buildings that I kind of developed this interest. And I was always interested in real estate. Just my undergraduate major had a big housing component. So when I got to Newark, I just started sort of combining my interest in real estate, New York City history, and tall buildings, and it just has taken off from there.
Well, New York certainly has an interesting history in terms of its development, and some of the quotes in your book that I found more interesting, I've written down, and we'll cover that. I do have an initial question. At Columbia, by any chance, did you have Lowell Harris as one of your professors?
No, actually, by the time I was there, I want to say I might have seen him once or twice at maybe a seminar or something like that. Him and William Vickery were sort of there, but they weren't teaching classes. So
Okay. I learned a lot from Lowell Harris, not as a student of his, but when I became interested in the work on property tax reform and began attending conferences. Lowell Harris was there all the time, and so I learned a good deal from him.
yeah.
I actually was introduced to Henry George's ideas during the early 1970s. I hadn't finished my undergraduate work yet, and I had a summer job in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And at the time, the governor, Milton Schaap, was trying to sell the state on a comprehensive land use plan. And so they had all these public forums. And I was working as a summer job for the press secretary to the Attorney General of Pennsylvania. And I asked him, I said, "There's these forums are going on land use planning. I'm kind of interested. Can I go?" And he said, "Yeah, cover it for me, write a report." And there I met a city planner from central Pennsylvania, and he was talking about how the taxation of land values could be a great stimulus for development in cities and also be a curb to urban sprawl. So those were trigger ideas that captured me. And
Yeah.
so I asked him, can you tell me more about this? And he says, well, you'll have to look up Henry George on the internet,
Yeah.
or not the internet, but the libraries.
Right, right.
And then about 2 weeks later, he sent me a giant pack of material that I put on my shelf and didn't really get involved with until I became a mortgage lender for Provident National Bank in Philadelphia, and I was appointed the community lending officer. And so my job was to go into the community group meetings in distressed neighborhoods and talk about what we can do to turn these neighborhoods around. So the link, what you're talking about in your book really is an interesting sort of outcome to me of the whole process of discussion about what constitutes redevelopment and reinvestment in communities, and how higher rise buildings can contribute to that revitalization. And I would like you to expand on your feelings about that, and how you've seen that occur in some cities with effectiveness.
Right. Okay. Well, sort of around the world. I mean, I guess I would say something like, as I think about this, I come from the point of view that the cities are present in our future. And so urbanization around the world has just been so dramatic. Um, so I mean, maybe there's two issues. We could perhaps go in two different directions. One is sort of what I was alluded to earlier about New York and how it rebounded, and maybe some other cities struggled, or just we could talk about what cities around the world are doing now as they face these massive, urbanization issues. So not sure if you have a particular
No, I mean your
point.
comments about New York and Hong Kong,
Yeah,
how similar they were in terms of being small land areas,
yeah,
and even Hong Kong, you indicate how little, how small parts of Hong Kong are actually developable because of the topography.
yeah, exactly. So in cities where there's an enormous population but very small land area, going tall is sort of the only, sort of it has to be. Uh, And that's the case of Manhattan. It's the case of the Loop in Chicago, and it's the case in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a very interesting because it has a very different land ownership model. All the land in Hong Kong is owned actually by the government, and they just auction off the land the long-term ground leases
Yeah.
and generate the revenue. So that revenue helps fund government. So it's a very different model here where people just buy and sell
I can
private
tell you
land.
that many of the listeners, people who will be listening to this program, are well aware of that situation in Hong Kong,
Yeah.
and look to it as a potential model for other cities, recognizing that that the structure of the program in Hong Kong has never been perfect
Right.
from an economic standpoint, but
Right.
it has been sufficiently good to make Hong Kong a vital place for business to operate and for people to migrate to,
Yeah.
despite all the other limitations.
Yeah, no, I agree. So this is not in the book, but I don't know if you're familiar with this op-ed piece, this opinion piece I wrote in the New York Times about expanding Lower Manhattan through
Yeah.
sort of land reclamation. So people, a lot of the comments about that were, oh, it would just be a giveaway for billionaires and all this kind of stuff. But if you look at Battery Park City, there's an authority that owns the land and they sell these ground leases. So if you creating new land like this, for example, there's no reason why you couldn't do a model like that where you have this entity, either the government or an aid or an authority sell the ground leases, and then you can develop it with many different uses and high rises and low rises and for business and low income people, middle income people, and so forth. So I think the Hong Kong, the model, like you say, is not perfect, but I think it represents an interesting case study in how to develop land.
And it was interesting how you pointed out that mainland China has adopted the same land lease structure
Yeah.
taking lessons from Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting. If you look, so to me, what was really fascinating. So if you is the following: if you look at what Hong Kong did in 18, I think it was 1841, when the British took control of Hong Kong Island, and immediately they were selling off the choice lots. And then, back home they said, "Don't do that. We're not really sure what's going to happen with Hong Kong." So they decided to sell the ground leases, and that's kind of how it started in Hong Kong. And then when China was doing its reforms in the 19, from 1978, and they set up the city of Shenzhen, they didn't have any property, private property for land, and they didn't know what to do. And the folks of Hong Kong, like, look what we do. And Chinese, government officials were like, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea." So they created this situation where every municipality owns the city's land and then sells the ground leases. China today is suffering from a massive real estate bubble. So again, it's not perfect, but it's just an interesting way of to me this story is fascinating, just simply because how one little decision in 1841 had these vast ramifications for urbanization across the world today. So I think it's an interesting story.
It's also interesting that the British authorities back in the homeland did not look at the results and say, this is something perhaps we got to really seriously consider, although there was quite the movement in the 19th century to try to get the economic grant of land collected. Uh, the,
Yeah,
the the budget of 1909 under Lloyd George, he ran into a battle just to get the lords to agree to have the land valued, let alone
right.
taxed. So, so the
Yeah,
institutional resistance was pretty strong.
right.
But when you have an imperial empire that can force decisions on other people,
Yeah.
maybe, as in the case of Hong Kong, you might get the right decision. Let's go
Yeah,
back to New York for just a second,
sure,
because I
sure.
thought some of you followed the trail of the Empire State Building, and its story I think is really interesting to tell. And you also referred to a quote about John Jacob Astor, which I thought was great. Uh, uh, that on his deathbed he allegedly quipped, "Could I begin life again, knowing what I now know, and had money to invest, I would buy every foot of land on the island of Manhattan."
Well, that's how he achieved a vast wealth. He was already rich when he started buying Manhattan land. So what he would do is he would buy up the farms on the northern fringes, and he would sell these ground leases to individual developers who would then build a house or a building, and he would just reap the ground, the ground, the rent from the ground leases, and then eventually they, maybe I think it was heirs were carving them up later on, but um, he was just one person. This was in basically the early 1800s. He just basically saw
Right.
Manhattan, the future of Manhattan, as incredibly. Yeah, he was just a visionary and seeing what was going to happen to
Well,
Manhattan.
now I didn't get a chance to check this out on the internet, but was the land on which the Empire State Building was built, was that owned by uh, Astor or some land company that leased the land, or did they sell the land to the Empire State Building entity?
Yeah, yeah, no. So it was really owned by descendants of John Jacob Astor. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel was two hotels owned by like his descendants. The hotel itself merged to be the Waldorf. It was originally the Waldorf and then the Astoria, or the Astoria and the Waldorf. I don't remember which came first, but there was actually dueling family members who built two hotels next to each other. There's an interesting backstory, but anyway, so the hotel owned the land, and so they sold it because they wanted to move. So they had this giant plot, and they wanted to move. And so in 1928, they announced that they were going to sell this large lot. Um, Originally, it was purchased by sort of a New York-based speculative real estate developer, and he had plans for a 50-story, there was like lofts, a building that was sort of more along the lines of what you saw in the garment district, that had lofts, it had showrooms, it had offices. But he needed to raise some extra money to sort of actually purchase the lot outright. And what happened is he couldn't make the last payment. And so then it reverted to the lot reverted to the bank that loaned. Um, his name was Floyd Delancey Brown. And so Brown lost the lot to the bank. And then it turns out that the folks who were running the bank knew um, Al Smith and John Raskob. And so basically, Al Smith, the former governor of New York, and John Raskob, who was a General Motors executive and financier, and also worked on the campaign of Al Smith when he ran for president. Uh, Through sort of connections, they took hold of the lot. And Pierre DuPont also was a big investor. So it went from the hotel to this speculative developer to the ultimate developers in pretty rapid succession. And then, so,
Completed in
yeah.
39. Am I correct? It didn't actually turn a profit from tenants until 51.
Well, yeah, it was completed in well, okay, not exactly. It was completed in 31, and the building was more or less in the early 30s, half rented, and they were losing money. They were making more money. They were making less losses because of the observation deck. One
Right.
of the interesting things about the Empire State Building is the original plans when Al Smith and Raskob created, they asked Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon to design them an 80-story, 1,000-foot building. It had no observation deck. But then when they saw Chrysler building, they said, okay, well, we want to go a little taller. So they added the observation deck. And so they added the mooring mast, the mooring mast. And then because there was a mooring mast on the roof, that area now was good for an observation deck. So they added this observation deck kind of at the last minute. That generated more revenue. But during the 30s, they were losing a lot of money. Raskob and Pierre DuPont were often adding equity to the company, and MetLife, which held the mortgage, they didn't want to foreclose because they didn't know what they would have done with the building. So
Right.
in the 30s, they struggled and struggled to just keep afloat, and then by the 40s, they were turning a profit again. Yeah, and then when they sold the building, they Smith and Raskob um, they passed away by both. I'm not sure when exactly the years, but by 1950, both of them had passed away, and so the heirs who inherited the building sold it for the highest price ever paid for a Manhattan for an office building in Manhattan, and then that was in 1951.
Yeah. I have the statistic. It was sold for 51 million. So they made $10 million on the original cost.
Yeah,
And then you estimate in 2013,
yeah,
it would sell for $2 billion.
yeah.
So we now have 11 years later. What do you think it might sell for today?
That's a good question. In all honesty, I haven't crunched the numbers. Having said that, the Empire State Building in the sort of era of work from home seems to be doing quite well. Its observation deck is doing well, and I think it has a relatively high lease up rate. They did a few years ago, they did a massive renovation. Um, and I think the bottom line is for many, particularly smaller companies, because it's an older building, the layouts aren't really suitable for large companies that want these expansive floor plates. But for the right company to be able to say, my office is in the Empire State Building holds a huge, cachet. People like to say that. So I don't know what the market value is. I'd have to crunch the numbers, but
Yeah,
it held up.
as someone who has uh, studied and taught Henry George's theories, for many years in the classroom, I when I when I approach this question about what the land is worth versus what the building is worth,
Yeah,
I have a hard time with a building like the Empire State Building.
right.
Residential property is pretty easy to understand. The value of a house is its replacement cost less depreciation.
Yeah,
So you get that number, you take the total market value of the property, and the difference is going to be the land parcel.
yeah,
When it comes to an income producing property like the Empire State Building.
Right.
And you just, referenced the renovation that's required. It seems like these buildings require an ongoing renovation, not just normal maintenance, but it's like, every time a brand new skyscraper is built, that Class A building becomes a Class B building. And
Right.
tenants are now going to say, well, you're not offering the same amenities to me as this new building that's built, 2 blocks up the street. So
Yeah.
maybe it's time to renegotiate the lease, or are you going to come in and rewire the place for artificial intelligence or something like that?
Yeah.
Um, do you have, as an economist specializing in this, do you have any sense of how to accurately value a building like this in terms of the technique of doing so?
Uh, well, okay. That's a great question. I mean, obviously, my approach would be similar to yours, is just to look at like the net income and do some kind of use like the cap value, cap rate, and there you go. But there's obviously a much larger social value that a simple kind of ROI or whatever type formula or
Yeah.
would generate. So um that's so the really the social value is much greater than, let's say, the value of the building itself. So I mean, simply just its place in the skyline and how it's lit up and the number of just it's the value of its iconness itself. That is something that you would have to throw in as a part of its value, and I don't know how you would even begin to do that.
Yeah, I don't mean to put you on this spot. It just, has always occurred to me. I give you a perfect example of, I worked in the stock exchange building in Philadelphia,
Yeah,
and across the street from me was about a 40-story, pretty new office building, and next door to it was a vacant lot.
yeah,
And uh, it was always interesting to me to look at what the vacant lot was assessed for
right.
versus the lot underneath the building.
Yeah,
And it was a significant difference, even though their locational value based on the public goods and services that are available to the site was so much different. And
yeah,
I had a hard time understanding how the assessors could do that. But in talking to an assessor one time, he said, well, that building, it was the Blue Cross and Blue Shield building. They're generating a lot of revenue. They can afford to pay the tax. That vacant lot isn't generating any revenue. They
right,
can't afford to pay the tax. And so
right,
they didn't assess it to its full market value.
right.
So obviously, from a perspective I have, that that vacant lot benefited by an enormous amount of imputed unearned income,
Yeah,
capitalized then by the market into a much higher and higher price for that vacant lot.
yeah.
Eventually, I think it was sold, but I don't remember to whom and by for how much. But but how do you see the construction of a brand new, really tall, high building in a city affecting the value of other buildings and lots in that would be contiguous to it or in the same general market area?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is kind of like the perennial question that you see in economics, because on one hand, there's this huge debate about gentrification and a tall building raising land values. But on the other hand, you see economists are always saying, well, more supply reduces prices. Uh, so I mean, so, so there's all these like little like subtleties to the and the little pieces to all these little pieces to this master puzzle. Having said that, if you build a tall building, um, it's generally a place that people want to be. And so in my research, I've sort of found that demand drives tall buildings, and and so if you build a tall building, it's it's either because the demand is obvious or there's some latent demand that that an enterprising developer realized has gone unmet. So if a developer builds a tall building and it becomes successful, then it's sort of the signal that the current uses are actually not matching the demand. So I guess to answer your question, I would see a tall building as a kind of providing information about the about what that neighborhood should be, as they talk about in real estate, the highest and best use. I mean, so if a successful tall building is created and it creates value for the lot, then it's also signaling that that neighborhood itself should probably have more tall buildings because that's people want where people want to be. Um, so that seems to be somewhat controversial because people associate rising property values and rising rents with with displacement and gentrification and things like this. But um, I think those questions are not being addressed by city officials because they're just content to have, okay, here's a building here, here's a building here. But if you really wanted to make a city more affordable, you would need a more systematic approach to citywide building. But maybe that gets things a little off the beaten
Oh
path
no,
here.
it takes you. You mentioned Jane Jacobs, I think, once in the
Yeah,
book, and I kept thinking about the battle between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses
yeah,
over what New York was going to look like.
yeah.
And I'm not sure who won that battle.
Well,
Uh,
it's funny you should say that because I have a blog, it's called the Skynomics blog, and I've written about this, and I've thought about Moses versus Jacobs. Uh, and again, I agree with you. It's not clear who won that battle, in the sense that each of them had a very different agenda, and each agenda, I think, was relevant for the 20th century. Uh, and so, um, yeah, I could go on about this if you want to go down this path. So, but
well,
yeah,
although this is specifically dealing with a particular geography,
right,
in my view, the dynamics are very much the same. It's a question of which special interests have the greatest political influence in any given place. Certainly, what happened in New York would not happen probably in Oslo, Norway,
right.
or you know, or Singapore for sure.
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, New York is very, well, the United States, cities in the United States tend to be very decentralized. And so there's a lot of like hyper local control. And so there's always this trade-off between the residents having a say, which they should have, versus what might be helpful for economic growth and development for the city more broadly. So, I mean, in New York City, Robert Moses was trying to kind of modernize the city, and highways and the slum clearance and stuff. I mean, in the 21st century, we look at all those things in a negative light, but Robert Moses was really, in some sense, the Trojan horse for planners that had been eager to build roads, eager to build public housing, eager to do slum clearance. They've been arguing these things for decades, and then when Robert Moses actually went ahead and implemented an agenda that had been uh, a wish on the wish list of many for decades. Jane Jacobs said, "Well, we should, well, slow down there on that agenda." And I mean, in some sense, she won the political victory, if not necessarily the economic argument. But so,
Well, thinking back into you had a little uh, part of your discussion about the Roaring Twenties, and said that the Roaring Twenties were a disaster for reformers in the cities because the building boom caused them to really just throw up their hands in despair,
yeah,
and no one knew what to do about zoning. No one really had a good idea about how to control these real estate moguls who were getting all their financing.
yeah.
Um, and with regard to New York City, do you know the involvement of Lawson Purdy when he was head of the tax commission?
Yeah. I mean, I
But I
seen
mean,
his. Yeah, I'm familiar
in
with
New
his name,
York,
and yeah,
what my understanding is, he got a 10-year abatement on the value of all new construction during the 20s, and building boomed.
hmm,
But then, if you read Frederick Lewis Allen's account of the 1920s, you see, how that optimism ended up having a real serious downside as a lot of land speculation occurred on borrowed money, and we had, a lot of the empty buildings not finished, defaults on the loans, and banks going, becoming insolvent. The hurricanes down in Florida causing, the loss of all the investment in Miami. I think I I I I don't know. I haven't really studied it, but how did New York survive the real estate down crash and then the Great Depression and come back to become the city that it eventually became? Is that something that you feel confident in dealing
Okay,
with?
so here's what okay, so here's a few thoughts I have. Actually, this relates mostly to my first book, Building the Skyline, because I have a whole book on what was happening in the 1920s in New York.
I wish I'd had time to read that.
That's fine. So I'll say this much. So what happened was in World War One, actually, it's interesting with World War One and its after effects. It looks a lot like COVID and its after effects. So after 1919, when the war was over, there was a massive shortage of a massive housing shortage. And so what happened is 1922, 23, 24, all this money poured into the housing market. And then when the housing market was finally kind of on it back in good shape, they turned to the office market in 25. So it was literally like a decade without much office construction in New York. So by 25, there was just a huge demand for office space that, unmet demand. And so it generated a bubble. The other thing I want to say is about the financial aspect of this. One of the blames for the Roaring Twenties office boom was these what they call gold bonds, these real estate gold bonds. So bond houses would issue small denomination bonds, and investors all over the country would buy these, would invest in these bonds, and the money would go to use to make development, it would go to finance
Right.
development, and then the revenues from the office buildings would then, pay off the bond, would pay the interest in the pay back the bonds. But I compared New York to other cities, and it's true that New York had the lion's share of the developers took the lion's share of these gold bonds, but um, compared to other cities, I think Detroit was like the worst city. So the first thing I have to say is New York's overbuilding, while bad, was not nearly as bad as its overbuilding in other cities, which were seem to have been much more susceptible to the financial aspect of the building boom. So that's the first thing. So um, the other thing too is we often use this is just maybe a side note. We often use the Great Depression as a kind of like it, it- as like a marker to sort of criticize and chastise what developers were doing in the Roaring Twenties. But the truth is that the Great Depression was so completely different than anything that had preceded it. The first Great Depression was in 1873. So
Right.
by the 1920s, there were a lot of ups and downs, a lot of sharp, maybe a financial panic here or a downturn here, but they usually bounce back within a year or something like this. And so if my estimate, my reading is if the Great Depression had not happened and there had been a downturn that was a little less severe, New York would have bounced back pretty quickly. Now, as for the Depression, I don't really have a lot to say other than um, just the buildings, I don't know. Actually,
Well, it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard for a real estate market to sustain high unemployment. And when consumer demand starts to drop and producers then stop producing because there's no money in the hands of consumers.
yeah.
So so it's
Right. So the Great Depression became so extreme because it turned into a whole series of bank failures, and then the tariffs, the international tariffs, the Fed policy was very restrictive early on, and so there was this whole perfect storm of economic events that conspired to make the Great Depression, make a regular depression the Great Depression. So yeah. So I mean, I haven't done a lot of research on the Great Depression in terms of the office market, other than to say New York, like other cities, they stopped building and they just muddled through.
Well, you think about it, the early part of the 20th century was still a time of rapid expansion of population. Uh, and a good part of that population increase came from immigration.
Yeah.
But you also heightened my interest in answering a question that I don't know the answer to. Um, After the Second World War, there was a tremendous baby boom.
Hmm.
Was there a similar baby boom after the First World War in the domestic population?
That's a good question. If I had known that you were going to ask this question, I have a spreadsheet on this, and I could open it, but it would probably be a little
Uh,
awkward.
well,
So,
in all
yeah.
fairness, Professor Barr, I'm not sure I know what questions I'm going to ask until they occur to me.
All
Although
right.
I have a lot of notes here of things that seem to be important. I led that question of immigration because you do spend some time talking about Chicago and Chicago's uniqueness. And one of the things I found interesting in that when you talked about Chicago in the 70s and the failure of the Sears Tower,
Yeah.
uh, that one of the observations you made was that Chicago did not become a global city in the same way that New York did or London did, and
Yeah.
therefore its attraction for for finance and the kinds of investment that make New York never made it to Chicago.
Yeah. Um, that's right. Well, Chicago, really its history and existence was really as a central node in the American continent. And so one could argue that its existence was really to connect, you know, uh, zones within the nation, whether it's
Right.
the wheat fields or the lumber yards or the coal mines, and ship out natural resources to the other cities that didn't have access to those. And so, in that way, it never engaged with Europe, let's say, like New York's, obviously was much more tied to Europe and other countries in a way that Chicago never was, just because of its location. And so in the 21st, if you look at Chicago's population, it's it's either falling still or it's kind of like kind of flattened out. I mean, the city itself, the metro area, I think is probably growing a bit, but New York today, has the highest population it's ever had, and that has a lot to do with just sort of its remaining an international hub, as it were, in a way that Chicago never did. But Chicago had, when it came to Skyscraper, had one advantage, which was that it wasn't architecturally tied to Europe in the way that New York was. If you look at New York's earliest skyscrapers, they're modeled after sort of Renaissance type buildings. Or the Woolworth building was called the Cathedral of Commerce because it had a Gothic architectural style. The MetLife Tower, which is in Madison Square, that was the world's tallest building when completed in 1909. That's like the Campanile, modeled after the Campanile in St. Mark's Square in Venice, I think. Chicago was just kind of like, well, we need some tall buildings. We're a bustling commercial hub, and let's just design them kind of, simply, practically. So it's in a kind of way, in an interesting way, Chicago is actually being far away gave it a sort of an advantage in the history of tall buildings at New York, at least an architectural advantage.
Well, it also the advantage of the city burning down gave them an opportunity to rethink what kind of buildings ought to be constructed. And when
Yeah, that's true. It definitely gave him a chance to sort of, yeah, exactly, to kind of reimagine what office buildings would look like.
a more general question for you. You talk about the impediments to building, zoning, height restrictions, setback requirements, required parking, et cetera, et cetera. Houston, Texas does not have any zoning restrictions. I don't know if it's been many years since I visited Houston, but I wonder how you compare a city that has, like Boston or most northeastern cities that have really strict zoning regulations with the kind of development pattern that occurs in a city that lacks those restrictions.
Uh, yeah, I'm a little, I, I don't know what to say. I hate to say this, but I mean, I haven't really studied, Houston in much detail. So, I'm a little reluctant to get involved. Uh, Other than to say, I've done some research on kind of cities and their relative stringencies around the world, and it's pretty clear that the more stringent the city is, the in terms of its ability to build, just sort of actually looking globally, there are literally and figuratively large prices to pay. Where there's more restrictions, there's higher rents or housing costs. There's actually more pollution because uh, these regulations generate sprawl. Simply because if there's a demand to go tall, but there's a cap, then you're essentially think about like a marshmallow. If you start pushing down on the marshmallow, it has nowhere to go except outward. And so
Yeah.
to, generally speaking, the more stringent a city's height regulations are and ability to rapidly supply to meet the demand, there's all these unintended consequences that I don't think people really fully understand, and one of which is sprawl. Now, Houston obviously is a car-based city. If you go to Phoenix, it's a car-based city. So, in a way, that's another confounding factor. Many of these cities like New York or Chicago, they have these massive subway systems and things like that. So, that's also part of the equation. So in a way, if you really want to do a city that's dense, not sprawled out, and affordable, you have to consider um, both the horizontal and the vertical at the same time.
Yeah, there are so many factors contributing to sprawling development. I live right outside of Philadelphia. I commuted into Philadelphia by train every day for 20 years and never had to ride an automobile. But it's amazing how many people are on the roads in and out of Philadelphia, in north and south, east and west, and almost there's no such thing anymore as a rush hour. It's like the automobiles
Yeah,
are there, in traffic jammed,
yeah,
almost most of the day and evening. And yet there are these opportunities to use public transportation, to get from one place to another fairly easily. But
yeah.
uh, as you say, we are so automobile dependent, and sprawling development has given the automobile even a larger life. Now, in the residential side of things, I was very much involved with a lot of design of transit-oriented development projects. So where there was a train station, if the redevelopment authority or the transit authority owned that land, try to get them to agree to, convert it to mixed use development. Are you seeing that kind of a trend in other cities, around the world, where they're taking advantage of their public transit systems to bring development in close?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, London is really was on the forefront of this. Just the just looking at where the tube stops were and allowing. So London's actually an interesting case because on the one hand they're very strict, but on the other hand they developed plans where they would be less strict along the transit lines. Cities like Shanghai and in Hong Kong for that matter, they're just building out their subway systems or their metros in a way that it's almost like the city itself is inherently one transit-oriented design project because most neighborhoods are very easily accessible through public transportation. I was with my son in Beijing, I don't know, many years ago, and well, not many years ago, maybe 2000. I don't know, 16 or 17, something like this. And I said to him, let's try to navigate the subway to get back to our hotel. And we went down there, and the both of us looked at the subway map and we're completely like, our brains just fried. And we say, let's just walk, because the subway system was so dense, so rich with so many lines and so many stops, that for a tourist like myself and my son, it was just like you couldn't just hop on it without the fly without learning kind of how to navigate it. Shanghai is a little bit more easier to navigate, and Hong Kong, same thing, and Singapore. But actually, in where I live, I live outside New York City in the suburbs, and there are many places outside of the city where they're engaging in transit-oriented design. Nobody really talks about the city of Yonkers, but I live very close to Yonkers, and I ride the Metro North, the train line into the city all the time. And you could see just along the train line they're building. Same thing with Jersey City. So I think what's happening is a lot of the stringencies about building tall New York City are being kind of undone a little bit in sort of cities just outside of New York, like Yonkers and Jersey City. I actually crunched the numbers for New York City. I calculated that um, outside of Manhattan, so in the other four boroughs, if you looked at the heights of buildings within basically a half a mile of a subway stop, something like 90% of the buildings in New York City within a half mile of a subway stop are 3 stories or less. And so there's a vast untapped area of the city that's just sitting there capped because of most of these places you couldn't tear down something and build a high rise because of the zoning primarily. And so it's a bit of a shame that there's so much land that's completely underutilized because it's so difficult to kind of allow for these transit-oriented developments in the city.
Yeah, when you wrote about London, I hadn't thought about this before, but you talked about London as having a major advantage in its topography,
Yeah,
because it's basically a very large flat plain.
yeah,
Now, London, I guess England as overall, they still very much have all these green areas around the city.
yeah.
How does that affect the development decisions as you get away from the central part of London? And you know, the land
Well,
might be
yeah,
available. It
right.
might be there, but it might not be available because of the green.
Yeah, you have these massive green belts outside the city. So it's funny. Okay, so a couple of things. Number one is New York City wanted to replicate the green belt. This whole idea of a green belt was very fashionable in planning circles um, in the Great Depression and the 40s and into the 50s. New York wanted to do the same thing in 1940, but ironically enough, Robert Moses was opposed to it. And so the City Planning Commission couldn't create this vast green belt. London, however, was able to do that. And so, so yeah. So in the, let's say in 1900, when there was no greenbelt in London, London more or less had an ample supply of land in a way that Manhattan did. And so there wasn't really the economic pressures to go tall. But partly because of London's global status and partly because of this greenbelt that surrounds sort of the greater London area, uh, London is basically trapped. Now in New York, we have our own sort of virtual green belt, because once you leave the city, you have just very, very strict single family home zoning in the suburban towns. And so,
As soon as you get out of the boroughs you're talking about.
yeah, exactly. So even in the boroughs, but once you cross over the border from, either from the Bronx, you go to Westchester County, or from Queens, you go over to Nassau County, and even in suburban New Jersey. I do this exercise with my students. We look at a zoning map of Maplewood, New Jersey, and basically 75, I don't know the exact, let's say roughly speaking, 75% of this suburban town in New Jersey is zoned for a single family house only, with minimum lot sizes of either 7,000 square feet or 5,000 square feet. So, that's kind of like a virtual green belt rather than an actual green belt.
Yeah, it has other implications too, and you spend a little bit of time in the book talking about inequality.
Yeah.
And one thing I've tried to say in community meetings about zoning and about permitting multi-story residential buildings in different communities. If you look at what's happened, you have many older families living in single family detached housing. Their children are grown up and gone, and they really should be turning over that housing stock to younger families, but they're not in any
Yeah,
large numbers.
exactly.
And so their adult children who might still work within a short distance of their parents' home are having to find housing further and further away.
Yeah.
I think that has contributed to this uh, growing commuting distance. And I think you would agree that now the definition of time is no longer, or distance is no longer miles, but it's time to get from one place to another. And I see this resistance to mixed use development and to higher density zoning as really having a negative impact on generational families staying within the same community.
Absolutely. And to me, the low-hanging fruit is the ADU, the accessory dwelling unit, or
Yeah.
subdividing your house. So if you want to have so let's say you have a garage that you don't really use. Or let's say that, I have a couple of things I want to say about this. First is, let's say your mother, your mother is alive and she's in her 80s and lives in this big house that you grew up in. Imagine you could convert the garage to like an ADU, a granny flat. She moves in there, and then the children can move into the house and have and raise young kids in the larger house, and you're more efficientizing that piece of property. Um, so LA, California is experimenting with ADUs, and I think there's some success with that. New York, Governor Hochul wanted to kind of legalize ADUs, but then I got turned down. And so, and I think Mayor Adams is trying to do this with his City of Yes housing opportunity. But again, ADUs might get rejected by homeowners who somehow fear that somebody converting their garage for an older person or a single person is going to somehow, wreck the whole neighborhood. But I want to say the other thing is a thought experiment. There's something like over 300,000 single family homes in the city of New York. If everyone added an ADU, you could add more housing in New York in that way than New York's like ever, added in the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, so um, that is one way out in the suburbs. You can easily add more housing and make the housing stock more flexible. But there's other ways to do it too. But I think that's the lowest hanging fruit that we seem to be resisting for no good reason.
Well, New York City was my territory, a part of my territory when I worked at Fannie Mae in the 80s and 90s. And I remember in Brooklyn, there were many legal three-family properties that were four. There were many fours
Yeah,
that were fives, and
right.
there were many single-family properties that had a rental unit in the basement or garage.
Right.
None of that was legal,
Yeah.
but none of the none of it was enforced because of the recognition that it was absolutely needed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't followed what's happened in terms of the codes in New York City, but perhaps you can enlighten us and tell us, are these units now uh, uh, wrapped in legal language that they're permitted, or are people still basically violating the
Well,
building
there's a whole
codes?
issue. I can say this much. There's a whole issue with the basement issue. So there's a lot of illegal basements. And when they get flooded, it creates this whole problem. So um, to be honest, I'm not sure where they are on this, but they've been trying to update the codes to allow for occupancy of these basements that are formally illegal. Um, Yeah. So I don't, to be honest, I don't have a good handle on how much sort of illegal, well, I don't know, or unregulated housing is being used. Um, but it's yeah, yeah. So yeah. So
That's
that's
fine.
okay.
Let me take you into another area that I think is of interest, and that probably not a lot of people who are listening to this will really understand is a real part of the office market, and that is the investment by foreigners, and particularly Arab investors. You mentioned in the book that the Arabs were a bit over optimistic about the potential for the Chrysler building, and then they had to sell it at a huge loss. And I wonder if your study of what foreign investors are doing, um, are they using sound economic analysis, or are they just, figuring if we build it, they will come?
Okay. So there's several answers to this question. One of which is the investment of companies. So okay. So you have a lot of these especially like Arabian countries with these vast sovereign wealth funds that seek to, invest in New York real estate or London real estate. Um, but even a New York real estate investor still has a lot, it's not easy for them. And so when the international investors come in and buy buildings, it's sort of they're that many fewer, they're that much further away from understanding how the dynamics of these markets work. So it is not proved out panacea. Um, in the case of the Shard, I think is an interesting example. So I guess what I'm trying to say is when I looked at the investment that these sovereign wealth funds and rich, oil-rich emirs and so forth were making in Manhattan properties. Some won and some lost. It wasn't quite like, a clear case that um, that it was really a bad idea or a really great idea. The case of the Shard is really interesting because the Irvine Seller, who was the London-based developer, ran out of money when the financial crisis hit in 2007, and he was able to get Qataris to invest in the project. But from their perspective, that was actually quite successful because most of the planning permission had been lined up and the engineering had already been done. And so here they are going into a brand new building.
Did they
Uh,
go in as an equity investor?
exactly, as an equity investor. And then they got some apartments, part of the deal. So that actually turned out to be a quite sort of a profitable thing. The other thing I'll say is, people complain about sort of billionaires' row as being these safety deposits for the ultra rich. But I find something a little bit different. If you look at I created a kind of a price index for investments in these billionaire condos over like the last 10 years or something. And I compared that with the same price index, the Case-Shiller condo index for New York City region. And the Case-Shiller goes up, but the billionaires row index just sort of hovers flat. And what happens is in the billionaires row case, there's what happened was I think it was around 2016 or 17. There was one billionaire row condo that came up and it was hugely successful. And it caused all these other developers to rush in with their version. And so the market got flooded with these condos and it caused the price to go back down. And then the COVID came. So the irony is in the billionaire row market, there's a very competitive supply and demand market that keeps the prices more or less flat. Whereas there's a not a in the broad New York City region, it's not very competitive at all, and so the price of the housing goes up. So the lesson here is there's sort of a mixed message from this. The lesson here is on the one hand, they're not really safety deposit boxes because the riskiness of investing in a billionaire's condo for a return on investment, it's high. The risk is high because of the market fluctuations. Having said that, because of laws about shell corporations and stuff, it's better. It's a better idea for money laundering. It's not necessarily a safety deposit box. Um, So if you want to make a good return on your investment and you're a billionaire, you're probably better off buying a mansion in a really tony suburban neighborhood in in Connecticut or in Chappaqua, New York, or something like that. So there's a bit of a subtlety to the story, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, uh, we don't have a whole lot more time. I wish I had another hour with you, and maybe we'll have to do this again. But um, one of the cases that I think is really interesting, you don't deal with this specifically in the book, but maybe I'm pointing to you a potential research idea. And that is the comparison of Detroit, Michigan and its history with Southfield, Michigan, contiguous to Detroit. And the reason I know a bit about this is because a colleague of ours at the Henry George School, his name was Ted Gwartney, he was the chief assessor for Southfield, Michigan, back in the 1960s. And he basically got the city, the mayor and the city, to make sure that they brought all the land assessments up to true market value. They didn't even have a two-rate property tax to give buildings any major benefit, as land value taxation might. But what was real interesting is that because Detroit was in such a bad shape administratively, companies kept moving out of Detroit, not to go overseas, but to go to Southfield, Michigan.
Hmm.
And so you have this picture of Detroit in the same basic economic environment, falling lower, losing population, losing businesses, and its neighbor, Southfield, growing and its skyline being filled up with high buildings and population. And I think that is a real interesting case of public policy by two contiguous communities going in opposite directions and the consequences thereof.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I was just in Washington, D.C., so they have the height cap, and you could just see if you walk on the mall, you could see in Virginia there's all these tall buildings. And so if you disincentivize construction or disincentivize supply to match the demand, you're just going to wind up yeah, people are going to find a
Yeah,
way
I
to
mean,
move around, make it work without I don't know if game the system is the wrong phrase, but uh
yeah. Well, if assessors do a better job at market value of properties,
yeah.
land value, and the depreciated value of buildings,
Yeah.
there is already a basic economic driver
Yeah.
that will lead to more investment in construction and new activity. Ted, at the end of his career, moved to Connecticut, and he was the chief assessor in Greenwich. And he and his staff made sure that their market valuations were kept current.
Yeah.
And I forget what year it was. It's probably in the early 70s. He said that because of their assessment practices, 70% of their total valuation was in land
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
Greenwich, Connecticut.
Right.
And I think that there is a valuable lesson there for policymakers and for our leaders of our communities. If that message can somehow get out and be accepted and adopted.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, you want to create the policy that incentivizes well, growth and densification. So I agree with you there.
Well, I would like to give you the last couple of minutes to cover any issues that we haven't covered that you think that people need to know about. What is happening with our cities, good and bad, and how the skyscrapers and the tall buildings contribute to either the progress of our cities or perhaps have a negative influence, if at all.
All right. Well, that's thank you, thank you. So I guess from the broad issue that I think about is when we talk about skyscrapers, people tend to focus on the tall building itself, whether it's a billionaire's row condo or the Empire State Building. Uh, and I think that looks at the trees but misses the larger picture or the forest. I mean, tall buildings are one part of this sort of urban ecosystem, and so. Um, I think it's important to understand that that all the locations in the city should be developed according to what is the correct, I don't know, for lack of a better word, correct usage or the demand is, whether it's transit-oriented design in the suburbs might have 7 or 8 or 10 story buildings, and tall buildings ought to be in the center because the land values are very high and that's where people want to be. So I think it's important to understand that we see skyscrapers because they reflect the this greater increasingly in the 21st century need for more clustering and for more social interactions, more economic interactions. Even a work from home environment, there's still going to be a role for the tall building. And the other thing I'll say too is, um, part of why we see tall buildings going up in Dubai and Shanghai is because they looked at New York and they look at Manhattan and they see how New York City became a global center in the early part of the 20th century. And essentially, that lesson was strongly learned by local officials in these cities. And so they realized that to be a global player, you have to have some tall buildings. And actually, I've looked at the numbers. If you look at some measures of like business interconnectivity and globalization and the tall buildings, they strongly relate. And there's this positive feedback loop between tall buildings and being sort of a global city. So the more tall buildings, the more globalness you have. The more globalness you have, the more tall buildings you need. And so not every city needs really tall buildings, but they need to be part of the large sort of urban suite of different kinds of real estate. So that's my
But
big takeaway
when
message.
land is valued by the square meter,
Yeah.
um, you're you have to build up in order to recover your cost of acquisition and development of that site.
Right. So it's not just the opportunity cost, right? So if land is very expensive and not developing it is sort of like, you're leaving money on the table. That's one way to look at it. But the reason why the land value is so expensive in the first place is because that is a place where people want to be. So one of the things I show in the book or talk about in the book is that if we have this lot that's valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, it means that there are more people who want to be at that location than that one lot can accommodate. So the tall building really represents the creation of vertical land where there's not enough horizontal land. And I think we really need to understand that essentially, if we think of land as a horizontal element, or physical space in the horizontal plane, we're misunderstanding land because land is a three-dimensional uh, phenomena. And so if we don't have enough land in the places that people want to be in, we need to create more land in the sky, as it were, or we need to create cities in the sky.
I was going to give you the last word, but I have one more question.
Sure, of course.
Are skyscrapers more green than other construction?
Okay, so since we're running out of time, I will only say if you compare high rises and mass transit use to suburban houses and driving, hands down, high rises and mass transit win. Having said that, super, super tall buildings, this big 2 million square feet office space, they use a lot of energy, and therefore we need, and we are these built. I gave a book talk at the Skyscraper Museum, and one of the sort of side discussions we had was that operational carbon problem has more or less been solved. So, operating a tall building with a low carbon footprint is something that's going to be increasingly like the norm. The real problem for the tall buildings are the embodied carbon. So getting rid of the carbon that's generated when producing cement and steel. And so things like a carbon tax and subsidizing low carbon cement varieties, that's the future. So The short answer is denser cities, more compact cities with taller buildings are much better for climate change than sprawled out low-rise cities.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I've learned a lot from you, and I look forward to reading your earlier book on Manhattan and the next one that you come up with. I'm sure will be out in a couple of years. So Professor Jason Barr, thank you so much for joining us here at the Henry George Schools program Smart Talk. That's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this program and other episodes, please visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. Again, I am Edward Dodson, and thank you all for watching Smart Talk.